Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Healthy Sex monthly meditations on sex and sexuality. Today's topic is vulnerability. I'm Dr. Alex Katehakis, the founder and clinical director of the Center for Healthy Sex here in Los Angeles. And I also am delighted to talk about this topic today, and I hope you are too, because I think it's a really important and often misunderstood the term vulnerability, not to mention the state of its being. So I want to encourage you to ask questions. The more you ask questions, the more you share your experiences, the livelier the conversation is, because then it becomes a conversation and not just a monologue from me. So if you'd like to ask questions anonymously, you can email them to charlie@centerforhealthysex.com, or you can type your thoughts into the comments box on Facebook, and I can answer them directly. So during the first part of the webinar, I want you to think about the question, when have you been wounded in sex or love? When have you been wounded in sex or love? And I think we've all had that experience at some point, one way or the other. And our quote for today is from Frederick Robertson, who says, "It is the place where we tear off that mask of guarded and suspicious coldness which the world forces us to wear in self-defense, and where we pour out the unreserved communications of full and confiding hearts. It is the spot where expressions of tenderness gush out without any sensation of awkwardness and without any dread of ridicule." So that, as our quotes often are, is loaded with meaning. So if we really look at the words to this quote, the place where we tear off the mask of guarded and suspicious coldness, the world forces us to wear in self-defense. And often we learn really, really young that we have to put on a mask that has us guarding our hearts because of safety and security. And if we grow up in households where there is a neglect or abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, where there's any kind of alcoholism or drug addiction, a very young child learns early on, both implicitly, meaning the system, the body learns, and also cognitively, we understand that we have to keep ourselves safe because the adults are not keeping us safe. And so that will doubly have us wearing a mask of coldness, of safety, in self-defense of others, because we learn to not trust other people. And with that, we need to, over time, if we're going to trust and be vulnerable in relationship and recognize that vulnerability really is our strength, we have to find that spot where expressions of tenderness not only come out, but gush out, which, is a big word and big metaphor, without any sensation of awkwardness and without dread of ridicule. And the truth is, there will be sensation of awkwardness. The dread of ridicule is another matter. If you dread ridicule, then you don't want to make yourself that vulnerable because it can be dangerous. You want to feel safe so that you're not dreading being shamed, humiliated. But you do want to allow for that feeling of awkwardness because that's natural and that's what will happen when you choose to make yourself vulnerable. So our next slide then. When we think of vulnerability and think of it in a positive way, it's really actually only recently that we've come to think of this as a positive attribute in intimate relationships. For so long, again, we've thought of vulnerability as something to hide or to be afraid of because we do want to protect our hearts. And yet the word vulnerability stems from vulnus, which is a Latin word for wound, and meant to be open to attack or damage. And most superheroes and gods in stories we see are invulnerable. That's what makes them superheroes or gods, that they can take all sorts of bullets and slings and arrows, and they cannot be hurt because their wound won't be opened to attack or damage. And yet we also know that many superheroes and gods in mythology have their Achilles heel, which comes from Achilles, whose one weak point was indeed his heel. So all of us are going to have that weak point of vulnerability, that point that's super tender And so when you do open yourself up to others, you want to make sure that they're not going to take advantage of your Achilles heel, of your most vulnerable spot. In fact, they're going to honor it and protect it, and help you protect it also. But each of the gods and superheroes, um, most wonderly. Recently, we have Wonder Woman, have their weaknesses. Otherwise, we wouldn't have stories about them. So, as such, with Achilles, his mother dipped him in the river of invulnerability as a baby, and his entire body was dipped into this baptismal water. But she had to hold him from something, so she held him from his heel, and it was that point that made him susceptible to death. That was the portal to death for him, because we have to remember at that time there were no antibiotics and there were infections and things of that nature. So remember again that most of us have this susceptibility somewhere, this one button, this one trigger, that our partners even know about. And so it becomes very, very not just painful, but just downright dirty to use that vulnerability that we know a partner has when we're arguing with them, when we're fighting with them. Instead, that should be off limits because we can always get our points across about the issue at hand, what we're struggling with, what we're angry about, what we want to negotiate without ever having to go down the road of injuring the person that we say we love the most. So know what your vulnerability is, what your Achilles heel is, and know what your partner's is, and don't abuse that, because that is not um, one of the attributes or the um, roles of having a secure, functioning relationship with another. The secure, functioning couple will protect those vulnerabilities. The fact that a term denoting the weakest link has come to be associated with emotional intimacy is a sign, hopefully, of an advancing civilization. There's little need for the physical self-reliance of our ancestors anymore. The world's threats are now so subtle and pervasive that most historical defense strategies are futile in modern times. So likewise, the historical primitive defenses we had in childhood are not really useful strategies in today's world. So in other words, if you're still behaving like a child and you're an adult, that's not really a good strategy for supporting yourself. What's a better strategy is identifying and accepting and processing our fragility with trusted others so we can transform our weaknesses into our strengths. Um, and we think of our vulnerability as being a weakness because it will make us weak, it will make us collapse or fall. But when we think of real vulnerability, open heartedness, the willingness to have your heart break, the willingness to have empathy and compassion for another, even though other people might think that you are weak or stupid or a bleeding heart, is really actually a strength. It's an attribute, especially in the world we live in today, which seems to be increasingly hardened around its heart, hardened around the truth, self-serving in unbelievably egregious ways, where we're taking what we want when we want it and without really much care or thought at all about the ramifications for the other. So it feels like it's getting more and more selfish and self-centered, that it's about what I want and what I need, and it doesn't matter that I'm using up more resources or I have more than enough, and that other people are going to suffer. I just want more and more and more. And that is not about being vulnerable. That's about being quite invulnerable. It's about being greedy and about being hard when it comes to others and the care of others. So does anybody have any thoughts or feedback as I'm talking about this issue of vulnerability and weakness and the transformation of it? Okay, so let's think about loving kindness then. To embrace vulnerability implies that we trust ourselves, that we're willing to take a risk also. If I'm going to make myself vulnerable to you, I have enough trust in myself that even if it doesn't land well with you, that I can lick my own wounds, or I can call somebody, or I can find somebody who cares about me afterwards to say, you know what, it's okay that you took that risk. You did the right thing. You learned something from it. And maybe the people around you learned from it as well. So when you make or embrace vulnerability, make sure that you trust yourself first and foremost to care for your own heart. And that, secondly, the people around you are trustworthy, because we have to bravely trust those around us to not hurt us. We're taking a leap of faith. And we most trust loved ones with our well being, our emotional states, and in some cases with our very lives. And if we don't have someone to trust our life with, then we are going to struggle in this life, because we all need a champion. We all need someone to have our back. We all need someone to pick us up when we fall, or when we take a risk and it doesn't go so well. Um, Paul writes, it's so difficult and strenuous to maintain the openness required for this by holding protectiveness at bay. And yes, this is a paradox, in fact, that you have to hold, that you're going to maintain an open heartedness, while also not being defended or protecting yourself at the same time. And I find one of the best ways to do that is just to be honest, to say, you know, I feel a little bit scared telling you this about me. I feel protective because I'm afraid of being wounded. So, in my conversation with you, I might say, I need to know from you that you can hear this and that you're going to be able to hear it without shaming me or judging me. And if you do judge me, that you'll tell me what the judgment is and that we'll work through it together, because none of us are perfectly non judgmental. But can you be in a conversation? Can you have a contract with that person about how the conversation is going to go before you reveal what the vulnerable thing is? So I often talk about, our talking. How are we going to talk about this? What are going to be the ground rules? How are we going to support each other in this process? And I think that can be helpful. And then Bob says, what if my legitimate needs happen to exacerbate my partner's pain? This is where I think it really takes a lot to be a grown up. And it's about how we talk to the other person. So using I statements is part of the most rudimentary thing that we can do. As when I talk about my feelings and how I'm experiencing this, rather than using you statements of you should, or you could have, or you always. So if I have a legitimate need to tell you something, and it um, activates your pain, I can start by saying, there's something I need to tell you about myself. And I'm afraid to tell you because I know it goes directly to your wound. Do you think you can hear this and have empathy for me without it going into what you're struggling for you? What's up for you? And that is, again, a meta conversation about it. And all too often, I think we all are guilty of this. We collapse into our own narcissistic pain and we make it about ourselves. So we're not really listening to our partners. We're not really having empathy for our partner. I want to immediately relate to me or my shame or what about me. And then it's all about me, and you're not getting your needs met. So hopefully that makes this clearer to you when you ask that question about that. And otherwise, you're going to be avoiding hurting your partner. And it's not about hurting them deliberately. It's about them saying, wow, I still have this woundedness here. And so you can never tell me that you're scared in the relationship. And sometimes you want to run in the relationship because, oh my God, it activates my abandonment issues. And you can't say that. I'm holding you hostage if you can't say that. So you have to be able to say, the closer we get, the more I feel like running in this relationship. And while that might activate my abandonment issues, I've got to be able to hold on to myself and say, well, tell me more about what happens for you that you get so scared that you want to run? I really want to understand that better. How can I help you from not running? What one thing can I do to maybe give you some space or comfort you, that has you wanting to stay? And by doing that, I'm actually giving service to you. I'm being empathic of you. It's now about taking care of you. It's not about poor me. I have abandonment issues. You can't say that, because if you can't say that, then what will eventually happen is that you will leave because there's no place for you to talk about it. And that's the bizarre irony in silence. So both of us have to be able to talk about it. And then at a later date, maybe tomorrow, once we process that, I have to be able to say to you, when you talk about running and wanting to leave the relationship, I get super scared, because my abandonment issues come up. I could never rely on an adult to take care of me, because, say, my mother, father, whomever was never there for me, which you already know. So, can we have maybe a safe word, where you're feeling like you want to run, but you're not really going to, but you feel that way? And so I know that you're having a feeling and that it's transitory. It doesn't mean that you're leaving today. And now we're in a more adult conversation about what our wants and what our needs are, and how we can help heal this wound. So I hope that answers your question. Um, and when we're hurt by family, when we're hurt by friends, it can be very, very painful. But to be wounded where we make love can leave us withdrawing forever because we're at our most vulnerable when we're both physically and emotionally naked. So we don't want to drag that woundedness into our sexuality, because that will always have us, not being completely present, not engaging fully and wholeheartedly with our sexual partner. Instead, we're always going to be a little withdrawn, a little protective of that. And then the sex becomes more of a physical activity or a physical workout and less of one that's a heart to heart connection. So think about the times when you have guarded yourself and kept yourself guarded in relationship, and how that guardedness then impedes how far you can go sexually with your partner. Um, because that's where we can, also, um, really shortchange ourselves. We want to blame the other by saying, well, the sex isn't that satisfying, or I don't really feel connected to my partner, when we really have to look at our own disconnection, especially during sex. So we could consider then that sex really is a vulnerable act. Um, and in a way, anyone who has sex is always vulnerable because our literally our nervous system, and our brain has to rearrange itself to have sex. It's not the same brain or neurochemistry or bodily, stress system as when we have our clothes on and we're walking around the neighborhood or at work. It's a different nervous system altogether, one that is indeed more vulnerable and really more, like you have blinders on, because the entire system is working towards high arousal in the nervous system. The fear centers have to be turned off for pleasure to be present. Um, and we've got to be somewhat relaxed at the same time. So we have to honor the fact that sex and sexuality has to happen in a sacred space, meaning a safe space, so that we can engender this kind of connection, identification with our own sexuality and with the other, and a sense of deep caring and loving and nurturing. So we shouldn't take this lightly either. Um, so, any thoughts about sex and sexuality and vulnerability? So, the question I asked when we began this brief, conversation is, when have you been wounded in sex and love? That was the question I asked you to think about, when I began. And for every painful moment, recall a moment where you safely received and shared openly with a lover. because we often tend to collapse into, there's been so much pain around my sex and sexuality. But have there been moments of opening, moments where you were felt safe, where you were able to share openly? And if so, affirm the values of safety and trust in your intimate relationships. And remember that you should trust those that are trustworthy. Don't give the keys to your house to someone who's going to forget to lock the door, or who's going to leave your space in disarray. So when you come home, you're angry because you trusted them with that, and they really weren't trustworthy to begin with. So we have a question here, of what if my legitimate needs happen to exacerbate my partner pain? Oh, I think I answered that question. Sorry. Um, oh, so that was the same question. So back to this then, about trusting those who are trustworthy, not putting yourself in the position to hurt yourself. So if, for example, you're into having casual sex with somebody and you know them, but you don't know them that well, but you also know they're not somebody that you want to be in relationship with for various reasons, you don't want to make yourself that vulnerable to that person, because they will fall short, and that's not their fault. You've already deduced that they're not really relationship material, or they're not really right for you for whatever reason. So don't put them in a position of hurting you and then blame them for you, because that puts you in a victim position. Make sure that you are the adult on board, that you have an adult sexuality, that you're agreeing to have sex with somebody, whether it's anonymous sex or casual sex, and knowing that you're going to only be able to reveal so much of yourself to that person, because in some cases, anonymously, they may just not care about you. They're just there for the sex. If it's casual sex, they may have limitations, or they also just know that this is an arrangement the two of you have, and they really don't want to get that deep with you. So be careful about where you put your attention and how you trust others. So Paul writes, it seems that overcoming trauma in sex is a slow process. And I would say, yes, it is a very slow process. It requires a long time and repeated small steps that can produce little victories that set the foundation for larger steps into trusting my partner. And so he's posed that as a question, but I would say that's true. And I think questions and conversations should be had between sexual experiences where you talk about the victories. And that's sort of what I'm saying. You affirm what's going well. You thank your partner for their patience, for touching you the way that you asked to be touched, for not touching you the ways you don't like to be touched in parts of your body. You talk about and celebrate those victories with each other, about how far your sexuality has come, and what you need or what's missing for you, or how can you explore in different ways, or maybe there are books that you want to read together, or a weekend workshop you want to take with each other that help you inch along down that path of trusting and knowing each other's bodies, and knowing, well, first of all, knowing your own body, but knowing each other's bodies and what you like. Also, taking small risks that have you feeling more confident sexually and competent. Because the more confident you feel, the more willing you will be to try things. And if you also have developed a relationship where you're in agreement that you can talk about sex, that when you talk about sex, about what you don't like, it's not about shaming your partner or telling them they're not doing it right. It's just about preference. It's sort of like when you think about touch, like some people like a very light touch, and other people can't stand a light touch. They want a more committed touch. So they want, to feel more of skin against skin and less light feather-like touching. So that's not a criticism. It's just about you having your partner's owner's manual. So if you have the owner's manual, you know how to operate your partner's body, and they know how to operate yours. So um, that's what you really have to be willing to kind of jump off the edge of and say, let's have more conversations about what we do and what we don't like. Okay, so are you vulnerable to flattery or seduction or back rubs? List what your weak spots are. What is your Achilles heel? And then share them with your trusted other. So that's often helpful if you can really start to think about today and make a list of what are the things I like, what are the things I don't like, what are the things that make me feel vulnerable where I might be saying yes when I don't want to be saying yes, especially if you're a victim of sexual abuse or a survivor in any way. Having boundaries and being able to say no might be difficult for you. Shame might come up when you do that. So if someone says, "Do you want a back rub?" a whole bunch of people would say, "Gosh, who doesn't want a back rub?" But someone else might say, "That's the way my perpetrator started to abuse me when I was little. And so I don't really like that." And they may not want to say it because you might think, well, that hurts my partner's feelings. But better to hurt your partner's feelings than for you to all of a sudden be in a state of fear and then, worse yet, start to freeze during sex. And then you're dissociating and you don't know why, and your partner doesn't know why you're present. It's because the back rub has activated your trauma. So get honest, tell the truth, tell it quickly, and be willing to work through those small struggles that come along between the two of you. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions here. And ask your partner to reciprocate. Um, be vulnerable enough to express these vulnerabilities. So it's not just about you making your list of what you like, what you don't like, but you also want to ask your partner to engage in this exercise with you. And you want to listen when they're talking. It's not about, "Oh, me too," or "Yeah, I don't like that either." It's not a back and forth. You should take turns reading each other's lists out loud. You should read yours out loud. Your partner should read theirs out loud. And then maybe you give each other a copy of your lists because you might not remember all of that, but you want to be able to focus on it and deliver that to each other. Um, so think of the most vulnerable people in your life and the larger world. Who is super vulnerable that you know of? This may be a child in your life. It may be somebody that you see coming to work every day. But see if you can bear witness to their vulnerability without judgment of it, without saying, well, they're a wimp or they're weak. Instead, have compassion for the fact that maybe they are sickly, or maybe their constitution isn't as robust or hardy as yours is, and that you want to see if you can engage some act of loving kindness toward that person and acknowledge each demonstration of the human condition. Lend your empathic awareness to strengthen all of humanity when you can. So be careful of your judgments today and every day, whether it's a homeless person or someone in the media. Just think about, wow, there's a wounded, scared, very, very broken person inside of all of that. So, how can I just know that and be with that vulnerability instead of wanting to hurt that person? Because I think that's what happens when we see our partner's vulnerability sometimes. It can engender a form of sort of normal sadism in us. Not sadism like you want to beat the person or kill them, but a feeling like, oh, that person's weak and I want to squash them, as opposed to, let me be empathic and curious and understand where this weakness is coming from. How can I help that person's functioning come up rather than bullying them or shaming them or ridiculing them and making their functioning worse, making them less available and less stronger, um, so that when they entrust you with their vulnerability or you see it, you are a champion of helping to strengthening it, not destroying them. And so, if we don't have any further questions today, I want to leave you with the thought of vulnerability being a source of your strength. It's not your weakness. It can be your greatest strength because you will take risks along the way. You will do things that will have you feeling good about yourself instead of hiding out behind your wall of defenses. You'll bring forward different parts of yourself that you were previously afraid to show. So take a risk today, be vulnerable. I want to remind you that Mirror of Intimacy is available on Amazon at amazon.com, and that we always appreciate any kind of testimonials or statements or even one word about what your experience of the book is. This is a good time to think about this book because it makes for a great Christmas gift or holiday gift, depending on what your religious or spiritual beliefs are. But give the gift of love, give the gift of compassion when you give the gift of mirroring intimacy to all those in your life. So thank you today from Center for Healthy Sex in Los Angeles, California. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions about sex and sexuality, you can call us at 310-843-9902. Our intake counselors are always standing by. We can give you information or resources for where you can get help in your city or town. Thank you and have a good day.